there's a very high bar for removal in the modern format. Not only is it about efficiency and its abilities itself, but removal really needs to stand the test of time when it comes to power creep in the format, and very few spells do so. Many of the traditional spells that we've seen throughout the format's history still aren't being played to this day, and whether or not Modern Horizons or Fire Design or maybe a combination of both have had anything to do with it is a whole separate video. But today I wanted to take a moment to highlight one of the most game-changing spells in Magic's history, not just in the modern format. A spell that changed the way we looked at certain creatures and what it meant to be playable at all, what it meant to die to removal. And that card itself is Fatal Push, a black spell that really, honestly, at the time of the spoiler season, a lot of people were quite aware as to how it would change the modern format and Magic in general, but a lot of people wouldn't understand its long-lasting impacts and how, again, the whole idea of dies to removal really warped around a card like this. But to really understand everything, you have to take a look back, understand where modern was at a certain time. Back old in the, way before days of modern, when Merfolk was still up there and Tron and Amulet were still playable decks, modern was at a point where Path to Exile and Lightning Bolt were the marquee spells. Of course, Path to Exile is no Swords to Plowshares. The downside of giving your opponent a basic is so powerful these days because modern is so tempo based in that way. It was still a card that really did everything you needed it to. Exiling was very important because cards like Faithless Looting were still around. It was important to make sure a card did not hate the graveyard. And then you had cards like Lightning Bolt, which honestly, being originally part of the boon cycle, was comparable to Dark Ritual and Ancestral at the time. I mean, maybe not today, but again, just being a part of that cycle originally and being one of the only cards before the time of 2015 that still sees play in the upper echelons of Magic. Lightning Bolt, I don't know. The day that we power creep Lightning Bolt will be a cold day in modern hell. I'll say that much. Now, we've had many shock variants, but they don't beat Lightning Bolt, and that's kind of what I'm highlighting here. Lightning Bolt is Lightning Bolt, Path to Exile is Path to Exile, but even Path has been power crept. We see Prismatic Ending, which has really funny interactions with taxing effects like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, or you have March of the Otherworldly Light and heck, even Solitude, which has the whole free aspect to it as well. And so you need to do things like that. You need to be instant speed, you need to be free, or have a value proposition that really doesn't have much of a downside. You need to have a restriction that can be really easily overcome. And that's what Fatal Push does, because it goes to destroy creatures at CMC, which really is honestly destroy anything. Destroy a creature at 2, or once you revolt, you destroy a creature at 4 converted mana cost. And in a format where efficiency really does matter, and it's really different honestly in Legacy, because in a format where you have reanimation and spells that cheat things out really easily in Legacy, the converted mana cost matters maybe a lot less. You have to have a lot more ability and text in your card, but in the modern format you have a lot less of that, so it really matters what you play on turn 1 and turn 2. But in a format where you have cards that are power crept out of the format, apparently X1s are not playable anymore. We don't see Blighted Agents, of course, thanks to cards like Ren and Six being able to ping them down pretty easily. But in a world of Orcish Bowmasters, why are cards like Ragavan still really powerful? It kind of meets that legacy marker of cards that do a lot. If you are to leave a card like Ragavan alone, you are going to be put so far behind. And I think many people know that already. Getting hit by Ragavan is not fun. Your opponent is immediately at turn 3. They might have taken a card off the top of your deck. Lord knows, you just have to hope it's not a Preordain or a Thoughtseize, or else they're going to run away with the game. But that's a whole different situation, because when it comes to stealing that value, you don't want that to happen at all, which is why we have a card like Fatal Push. It comes down on one to match the Ragavan. It is instant speed to be able to remove that card on your opponent's turn if you are on the play. So a card like this is really important at its base level. I mean, heck, it also answers Orcish Bowmasters. But the Revolt is key too. Because some people have also talked about what if the revolt only triggered if a non-land permanent left the battlefield. And I think Wizards, research and design did a very good job at understanding that that's just not good enough. There are not enough good effects of a non-land permanent leaving the battlefield without maybe flickering, where something like that even matters. They wanted to create a mechanic that has eternal playability, albeit Modern is not by definition an eternal format. Revolt as a mechanic would then be able to be revisited and reused further down the line. And Revolt is really powerful for that. In a format of fetches where your fetch land does leave the battlefield to then tutor and search for a land, Fatal Push is really easy to enable. And so a lot of times it really is just a destroy target creature. Very few examples exist out there where Fatal Push is not able to remove that creature and that said creature is still playable at the upper echelons of Modern. You can play whatever you want, doesn't mean it's going to be a good deck. But the examples that I see honestly are Primeval Titan at the top of my head, the Emrakul's, or the big I don't know, Eldrazi out of the Tron decks. There are few examples again that this card does not hit, and which is why when a card does lose to Fatal Push, the whole dice removal argument is also thrown out the window these days. Because look at the look at cards like Uro, a card that's banned in Modern now. We've had newer versions of this. We have the most recent edition of Flage to be a small hint of a cycle that will one day be completed, and thank the Lord for the 10 guilds, because that probably means we will have 7 more of those godforsaken cards. Whatever they will do something busted further down the line. So Uro was the most busted example. We had the Rakdos one, which I mean, apparently, just being restricted by its colors. Flage has a lot to offer, being Lightning Helix for free. And it needs to be able to come back because it dies to Fatal Push, dies to removal, because that doesn't matter anymore. The dies to removal metric doesn't mean anything anymore because cards do too much. If the card doesn't die, it runs away with the game. Whereas cards beforehand, if they didn't die, okay, the card generally just dies to removal. You just have to hope your opponent doesn't have it. But nowadays, cards do a lot. So you need to have the removal. You need to have the efficient removal that does everything. Fatal Push just puts a card into the graveyard. And again, in a Modern world where or Faithless Looting, I should say, doesn't exist, that's important. It does mean a lot of times cards do die. There are reanimation targets, of course, and there are spells that will bring things back from the graveyard. Living End is still a thing, but again, a lot of cards in Living End don't even get hit by Fatal Push. There are a few examples of such cards, but again, if you're grinding against Living End, you hit the jackpot, honestly, at that point. But Fatal Push does that so interestingly. It is single-handedly responsible for what many would consider Tarmogoyf being unplayable in Modern. Now you have efficient answers for Death Shadows and your Tarmogoyfs. I mean, when's the first time that you Fatal Pushed a Raging Ravine? I mean, let alone the nostalgia that many people have for such a card. It was a great answer to those creature lands, to those cards outside of Field of Ruins and stuff like that were printed down the further down the line. Ghost Quarters tended to be the answer, but Fatal Push had this proposition to be able to answer most. It didn't kill a Kiki-Jiki, but it killed Restoration Angel. So it really hit many parts of different combos, and it changed the way that certain creatures were evaluated. Because yes, the Jund decks were also playing Fatal Push, but that meant the Jund decks had answers to opposing Tarmogoyfs and Dark Confidants and other stuff that would generally run away with the game. Because cards like actually, that's a really good example now that I think of it off the top of my head. I wanted to use this example or this section to really talk about Tarmogoyf, but Dark Confidant is actually a better example of something like this, where Dark Confidant was a card at really rate was pretty bad. 2 mana for a 2/1, not great, but the value that it had off of giving you a free card every turn was really powerful. And that's why you want a removal spell to be thrown at it. But do you want to really match it in terms of removal spell? Do you want to spend 2 mana on a Dreadbore to kill something like a Dark Confidant? It doesn't feel great in terms of the resources that you use on just a removal spell, but your opponent was able to spend mana to then forward their game plan and maybe even get a free spell out of it. And so that's where something like Fatal Push becomes even better. The 2 CMC and 3 and heck even 4 these days with cards like Shieldred are really important to answer at these efficient rates. Now, efficiency, it's a whole different discussion in Modern, because we have the Modern Horizons 2 elementals that really broke that metric, really changed the way that we look at design like this, and those cards will be around forever. I mean, do you see Solitude ever really getting banned? I mean, maybe Subtlety one day, but again, that card is probably not going anywhere either. Cards like this do break the Modern format, and I really hope that comment ages poorly. I really do hope that it really does, because the free spells don't really have a place in Modern unless they have a restriction. Force and Negation is an interesting one, because I will give it a pass because of its restriction on when it is free. The cost of it is also important. Again, in a format that does not have Brainstorms and Ponders, where you aren't able to select for key cards, it is important to have options like this for certain archetypes to be able to survive. But Fatal Push and its ubiquity are what's important as well. I mean, highlighting the fact that red had Shock and Lightning Bolt, you had white with a lot better options than Path right now. Green has creatures that tend to speak for itself. I mean, think of something like Primeval Titan, and blue just opts for an angle like Force Negation that doesn't even want the spell, the creature, the whatever to resolve at all. It doesn't want your things on the battlefield to answer, albeit Otawara is also an answer that exists out there as a pseudo uncounterable option for many of those permanents. But when it comes to black didn't have options like this before. And that's what I also want to highlight. Black didn't have any better option than Fatal Push. It had cards like Deathmark, which actually, albeit at sorcery speed, answered cards like Huntmaster of the Fells or Primeval Titan. I mean, look, when's the last time you heard a Modern video or a video anywhere on the Magic Sphere talking about Huntmaster of the Fells? Leave a like for that one. Come on. When I was doing a little bit of research, I was going back to the whole Thing in the Ice days, and I was like, ooh, Modern was an interesting time at that point. You know, Thing in the Ice these days would probably just like flip for free, and then like you would have to, like, your opponent or you would have to pay mana to keep it unflipped, and there'd be some way to like keep it flip for free. I don't know. Look, cards like that don't exist anymore. Huntmaster of the Fells is too slow of a card, and especially now because it just dies to so much. But Fatal Push represented a great way to use one of the most busted cycles in Magic's history, the fetch lands. They arguably are more powerful than the Power 9 in itself in many ways. The Power 9, obviously being restricted in their own ways, are extremely powerful, but in terms of their overall impact in Magic, because the Power 9 have been banned, they've been put onto the reserve list. I think it can be argued that, of course, if they weren't put on the reserve list, they would be, you know, kind of meta defining in every format they're legal in, which is fair. But in a world where they are in the reserve list and not playable anywhere outside of Vintage, fetch lands are the most powerful cycle of Magic cards out there. And it only makes sense that a card that abuses the fetch lands themselves with the revolt trigger would also be really powerful. And Fatal Push, going back to that whole idea of not having good removal outside of, you know, kind of one, Deathmark was that example I mentioned, but that's why, you know, the Doomblade test was around. The whole dies to removal moniker really came from Doomblade and Necrotol and stuff like that. But we don't need to be printing Necrotols and Doomblades, Murders and Hero's Downfall and all that stuff. Whatever, insert standard playable removal spell. We don't need that printed for free or at one. Can you imagine if Fatal Push destroyed a creature or a planeswalker with CMC 2 or 4 or less? It would be the most busted removal spell in Magic's history. Just let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Again, if Fatal Push removed a creature or a planeswalker with the same restriction and same design, 2 CMC or less, Ren and 6 would just be a $5 card, right? That card would be near unplayable at this point, and black would single-handedly be the best color in Modern. That would be a whole different timeline, and I think Wizards fairly kind of balanced all that, because being at instant speed is also like kind of the busted part of it. Inserting myself to also highlight that the other options that existed just were weaker. I mean, you had stuff like Disfigure, which was like a short -2/-2 effect. I mean, there was a time when this card was also playable in something like Pauper, but you also had something like Dismember. Now, Dismember, I mean, okay, let's be honest, this was a card that only existed for primarily the colorless decks or the decks that couldn't afford the colored tax actively that Fatal Push had. It maybe didn't have permanents that wanted to remove, or heck, the Tron decks just needed something that was a clean answer to something. It also was some way to get around indestructible effects. Indestructible was still a relevant thing way back then, but now, I mean, with something like Solitude running around, indestructible isn't as relevant, which opens the space for something like Fatal Push to be a lot better as well. Tragic Slip is also an option. I mean, you need to have something die, which is honestly a big ask when it comes to enabling your own things and being a control mid-range style decks. You don't want your one threat like your Frog to be able to die just to enable a removal spell that honestly only did -13, which honestly may not be good enough when it comes to certain pump effects. And you had cards that maybe destroyed an Eldrazi creature specifically for one, or destroyed a non-black creature, but then, you know, it couldn't be regenerated. You lose like life equal that creature's toughness. Like, there are other options that exist out there, but sometimes when it came to destroying creatures, the restriction was too heavy. Again, something like Vendetta made it so you can only target a, oh, I hit my mic there, you can only hit a non-black creature. You can't kill Orcish Bowmasters or Shieldred in this day and age with something like that, and you lose life on top of that. Imagine killing black creatures in Modern these days and losing life because of them. You essentially did what the creature wanted you to do. You still lost that exchange, similar to Path to Exile. But being on rate for that much is very important, because black had to splash into other colors to be able to do anything close to what Fatal Push wanted to do. You had to go to white for Path to Exile, you had to go into red for stuff like Dreadbore, you had to go into green for something like Assassin Trophy, albeit Assassin Trophy came like much later. I'm just talking about like the amount of analogous effects that you get, Assassin Trophy being able to destroy like a permanent and everything. The things that you're able to do just have so many restrictions. And I recently put up a Twitter post about how, you know, what would be the equivalent of expressive iteration in Dimir, and I had a great comment that responded and said that it was actually Drown in the Lock. And Drown in the Lock, again, and being another restriction of card in black paired with the blue, has restrictions because it requires your opponent to have a graveyard. And so in that sense, it works very well with options in Death Shadow, albeit in Modern Mill as well, where cards are generally putting cards into your opponent's graveyard, creating resource advantages, and then taking advantage of those resources. In that sense, that is what Drown in the Lock wants to do. So those color pairings usually were the route that black had to take, although you then had to maybe play Murderous Cuts or one Hero's Downfall at the top end to be able to kind of match up with what's going on right now. You could probably play like Eliminate. It's not like Jace the Mind Sculptor is that playable in Modern right now. There are a fair amount of things that you can answer with Eliminate, albeit right now it'd be very different because Karn the Great Creator is still a very powerful Planeswalker. So Eliminate probably doesn't really have that much to say. So you probably want to be hitting more Planeswalkers, and you have so many more things like Bedevil, which I mean is very restrictive but has a bit of optionality. But optionality may not be what Modern is looking for now. It's looking for rate, because as spells become more efficient, as cards do more for their cost, it only makes sense that the removal spells kind of line up. Now imagine if Grief also did what Fatal Push did, but like for free, right? So, you know, let's say it just destroyed a creature with CMC 4 or less. It didn't have the Thoughtseize effect. It had Menace. It was, you know, it was the 3/2 and all that stuff. Would Grief be banned right now? Would it still be powerful? Well, if it was just Necrotal on an elemental, would it be way too powerful? It'd be very similar to Fury, which is probably why they didn't do it. They wanted to keep the kind of removal to the red creature in that way, but they also wanted to make sure that not everything was necessarily about removal, because in similar ways, like Subtlety could be seen as that as well, because it's not really a counter spell. Subtlety has that interesting angle to it, and then Solitude is hard removal in that sense. So they wanted to do something different with black. They wanted to have like an unmask effect, and that's also another card that is a free spell that doesn't exist in Modern, but is a template for something that is an analogous effect in something like Thoughtseize or Inquisition of Kozilek. And so we don't have that effect in black, because Wizards of the Coast understands that when you design removal, you have to have big restrictions for it to be free. And the difference, I hope that many of you understand, between 0 and 1 is infinite, and the difference between 1 and 2 is almost double. It is, you know, Fatal Push is doubly as efficient as Doomblade, and Fatal Push doesn't even have a color restriction to it. It's even more. Doomblade can't destroy black creatures. Fatal Push can, and that was a common restriction that a lot of black removal spells had that Fatal Push doesn't either. It just requires a revolt trigger. And all this is to say that I just wanted to highlight why Fatal Push was one of the single best removal spells ever printed. it changed the way that we looked and played Magic, because it abused the lines that we had with our fetch lands. It circumvented a lot of the markers and kind of the kind of lines of playability that we had that a card needed to reach. It surpassed Path to Exile and Lightning Bolt in many ways, because those cards generally aren't clean answers to certain threats that we have now. You don't want to Path to Exile a Ragavan. You've essentially lost that exchange already. You don't want to Lightning Bolt a Shieldred. I mean, you need two of them, let's be honest. I hope y'all can do the numbers there. Fatal Push can answer both of those threats really well, and it can do a whole lot more with a lot of other threats in Modern. But of course, it shouldn't be able to answer anything. You shouldn't be able to Fatal Push a Primeval Titan. You shouldn't be able to Fatal Push like Big Eldrazi. That's okay. That's where you have other removal spells. That's where you have counter spells. That's where you use your other color combinations and your other cards in combination to be able to circumvent, beat, be faster, or whatever it might be against those threats. But Fatal Push covers a lot of it. And that's why I think a card like that is really important to just highlight over time. It's a topic that I've always been thinking about, and I put a Twitter post out about it, and it's just one I wanted to yap about today. So I appreciate y'all joining me in my yap session talking about Fatal Push. It's a card that really stands the test of time. And the moment that we power creep Fatal Push, that'll be a crazy day in Magic's history.